Our opening words are by Reverend Leah Ongiri. Here we are together, each facing our different human tasks, or maybe the same central one, to embrace the lessons life delivers, to discern and respond as we grow, to refuse harm and cherish flourishing. May we know ourselves as vessels of infinite possibility, holders of each other's heartaches and tales of joy, weavers of one story in which we each have a part.
This is Reverend Dr. Lisa Hike telling the story, Grandmother Spider Weaves the World. Long, long ago, and yet just yesterday, somewhere far, far away, and yet right here, there is a cave full of darkness and firelight on the bank of a stream. In the cave lives an old woman, Grandmother Spider. She is weaving the most beautiful shawl there ever was. She has been doing this for a very long time, for so long she can't remember when she started, maybe even before the beginning. Her ancient, gnarled hands are full of threads of all colors and textures, shimmering blues and greens, fiery oranges and reds, warm, glimmering golds, and cool, shady grays. She is weaving them into patterns so intricate and complex they take eons to complete. She's getting near the edges of the shawl, where she is attaching porcupine quills to finish it. She has to flatten each quill with her teeth, and she's been doing this so long that her teeth are worn down to nubs. And yet she works on, weaving and flattening, weaving and flattening. Now in the very back of the cave there is a fire, and over that fire hangs a cauldron. In the cauldron is a stew containing all the herbs and seeds that grow in the world. Every so often the old woman has to stir the stew, otherwise it will burn, and who knows what troubles might ensue. So she gets up from her place at her loom and slowly, painfully makes her way to the back of the cave. Now Coyote has been sitting at the entrance to that cave, dying of curiosity. What is the old woman doing in there? What are those glimmers of color he catches sight of when he peeks inside? What are those good smells? The moment the old woman gets up and turns her back, he sneaks in and rushes over to the weaving. He sniffs at it and paws at it and sniffs at it and paws at it. He finds the end of a thread and takes it in his mouth and pulls on it and pulls on it and pulls on it some more. And you know how it is with weaving. If you pull out one thread, the whole thing comes unraveled. Well, Coyote is having great fun growling and shaking the mass of unraveled threads, spreading them from one side of the cave to the other. But then he hears Grandmother Spider coming back. Uh-oh, he's going to be in big trouble, so he slinks back out as quick as he can. when Grandmother Spider returns, instead of her beautiful creation, she finds nothing but a chaotic mess of destruction. She sits back down in her chair with a handful of thread and stares for a while at nothing. And then she realizes she's been at this work since before the beginning, and she is tired, and she is lonely. So she calls on her siblings and her children and all of her other relatives, and they call on their siblings and their children and all of their other relatives. They all crowd into the cave. Hummingbird is there, and bear, and bat, and ant, and earthworm, and mouse, and hawk, and deer, and opossum. Many of the swimming ones, too, in the stream at the mouth of the cave, and the rooted ones are standing just outside. Even Human, the youngest of all, is there. And Coyote is coming, too, all humble and ashamed for now. The relatives hold council for many days. They think about all the colors and textures of the threads. They spend quiet time letting visions come. Pretty soon Coyote gets bored and runs off to find something more interesting to do, but the other relatives begin to speak to each other. And as each one speaks, the others listen. Even the smallest and the youngest speak and listen. And they begin to understand that while Grandmother Spider has the job of weaving the shawl and stirring the pot, and the others each have their own job, they can keep Grandmother Spider company. They can take turns telling her their stories and singing her their songs, sharing their longings and their visions. And so they do. And after a time, into Grandmother Spider's mind comes a new design, a design even more beautiful than the last. And once again, she takes up the threads and begins weaving the most beautiful shawl that ever was. And that is the end of that story. Or is it just the beginning?
All right. Well, I encourage you. We've spent the weekend, many of us have spent the weekend talking about the stories of this church and the stories that we want to weave into the future of the church. So I encourage those of you who are getting ready to go to your classrooms to think about the stories that you want to tell about this church, about what you want this church to be for you and for your future, and to share that with everyone around you. Our reading this morning comes from Chris Bateman. It's entitled The Stories We Tell. Our lives are shaped and guided by the stories we tell about ourselves. There are the stories you tell about yourself, your self-image, which dictate what you can bring yourself to do or attempt. There are the stories you tell about others, innocent gossip, news and chatter, or pernicious slander, prejudice and defamation. There are stories we tell of the interpretation of observations, which go by the misleading terms facts and knowledge, and stories we tell of what cannot be observed or tested, ineffable beliefs, which philosophers term metaphysics. The stories we tell are fundamental to who we are, but they are also elemental to what we can achieve. One story told in an appropriate fashion and couched in language viable to its audience can change the world. Indeed, there are many such stories which have already changed the world. Zarathustra's or Plato's stories of good and evil as absolutes, Buddha or Jesus's stories of universal love, Darwin's stories of descent with modification, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard's stories of reality as interpretation, Einstein's story of relativity. The question we face in trying to get to grips with our existence appears to us all too often as which stories are true. Yet truth in this sense means little more than assessing compatibility with the stories you have already accepted. Instead, I suggest the question, which stories shall we tell?
The theme for this weekend has been the power of stories. And I do not doubt for a minute that stories have power, whether they be stories about the history of UUCCI or personal stories that may stretch back decades, or stories from last week. The story I'm going to share with you is decades old, and the story is interesting in its own right, but I think the real power of this story lies in what the participants might have learned from being part of the story. On the surface, this story involved what was and still is, I suspect, a common occurrence in the life of a teacher, particularly primary and intermediate level teachers, and that is behavioral issues that need to be addressed. The teacher utilizes his or her experience and skills, along with some knowledge of child psychology, in order to address the problem. Hopefully the teacher is successful and we move on from there. But the story behind the story is often a bit more complicated. This story happened in the mid-'80s in a split 4th, 5th grade classroom. And at the time, in the school where I taught, all of our 4th and 5th grade classes were split classrooms, which had the benefit of having students with you for 2 years at a time. And what I want to share is a story involving 5 5th grade girls. They were in the 2nd semester of their 2nd year with me. They were close friends, kind and empathetic, supportive of each other, good students, very much engaged in school. They had been good role models for our incoming 4th graders. And then something changed. I was never sure what sparked the change, and I'm not sure that they were either. But they became very combative with each other, verbally, though not physically. There were complaints and accusations and grievances. One day it was 3 against 2. The next day it was 2 against 1. The next day 2 against 2. They're telling lies about me. She's trying to take my friend away. I didn't do anything and they just ignore me. I don't like her and she won't leave me alone. I heard it all. At first, I tried to deal with these episodes on a case-by-case basis, but it was almost like dealing with wildfires. I would address one problem and then something else pops up elsewhere. After a week or so of this, I thought that I needed to have all 5 together in one place for a talk. And so one day I told them to stay behind when the class went out for morning recess. I did not get into the particulars of their separate stories, nor did I suggest consequences they might face if these behaviors continued. Nor did I raise my voice in frustration. I simply told them how I was feeling about what I was witnessing. And I was upset and distressed, and it really pained me to see what was happening. I was confused because I felt that I knew them all well, and these behaviors were so out of character from who I knew them to be. I remember saying to them that I had a son, but no daughters. But if I did have a daughter, I would be proud to have a daughter like any one of them. And that's when I began to see tears running down their cheeks, almost as if on cue, and from all 5 of them. Now, I did not go into this with the goal of making 5 fifth-grade girls cry. In fact, I was surprised when it happened. But when I reflected on this later, I hope they came to realize that they are not the sole actors in their lived experience, in their stories, if you will. Individually, they were obviously in pain. The other girls in the group were also in pain. But I, someone who I hope they respected and looked up to, was also in pain. And I really don't think they had considered that until they heard it from me. And so how did all this turn out? The distressing behaviors ended, and they all went back to being the kids I knew them to be. And I don't know if any of them remember this story. I hope they do, and I hope they retell this story still. I mean, they're almost 50 years old now. But even if they don't, it would be my wish that it caused them to think about the impact their lived experiences can have on others, and that it might have boosted their reservoir of empathy.
Once upon a time, in the beginning, a long, long time ago. So what happened was, these are all the beginnings of stories. And when we hear those words, our ears perk up. We start to listen because we know we're going to receive something, a story, a tale that might interest us, that might engage us. And our lives are full of stories. From a very young age, we are told stories. Stories to help us go to sleep, stories to relax us. And then we slowly, as we get older, begin to tell stories, and we tell the story of our day. We start telling the stories that we have heard. We're reading stories. So we are filled with stories. Stories can be defined as events linked in sequence over time according to a plot. So just think of separate times, and then we just weave those events together and create a narrative, and that's what a story is. And in the field of narrative therapy, we talk about how we can shift our story by adding a different plot to the same events that we have laid out. And we can then start to redefine ourselves by understanding all those different events differently. Now, this isn't about creating a fiction, creating some wild fantasy about who we are. It's about grounding ourselves in what has happened in our lives or what we've experienced. And then taking a narrative that shifts maybe how we have brought that story to life, how we've told it in the past. When I was young, as a child, I used to sing in the church choir, and I loved singing. And then somehow in middle school, I think it's when my voice started to change, someone told me that I couldn't sing, and I believed them. And so I started to tell the story that I could not sing. And all through high school, I would say, oh yeah, no, I can't sing. I don't sing. And into college, and I was invited to participate in some choral opportunities. And I said, oh no, not me. I don't sing. And it wasn't until an adult and I was listening to LGBT gospel choir in Boston. And I was listening to the music and I was feeling just the energy and seeing people like myself singing gospel, which is not something that I had seen. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to be in that space. And then after the concert, they said, we welcome everyone to come if you want to join us. And after the first concert, I got excited and I was like, oh no, but I can't sing. And so I didn't. And then I went to another concert and I thought, well, they did say everybody. You know, maybe I can go and see and, you know, maybe I'm not horrible. Maybe I can do just enough to be in the choir. And so I went and sang in the choir, and they told me that I was a tenor, and they placed me in the choir and I sang, and no one ran screaming, you know. And in fact, after singing, someone says, oh, you have a nice voice. And I was shocked. I had not thought of that of myself. And then I started to remember that I used to sing as a child, and I had completely forgotten about those times when I sang in the church choir and sang in school choirs and loved it. That story, those events were gone out of my mind. And so I started to reclaim the identity of singer. And I started singing in church choirs, and then I'm a theater person and I auditioned for a musical and they actually cast me. And I've been singing ever since. And now as part of who I am, I will say I am a singer. And it's sometimes surprises me as I think back of that time, those many years that I lost the chance to sing because I had listened to a story that someone gave me. Not the story that I was telling myself, but the story someone had laid upon me, and I believed it. And so I think sometimes we have to think about what stories we want to tell. What stories are right for us to tell? Just as in the reading, we sometimes wrestle about what story is true. But maybe we actually need to think about what stories we want to tell and how we look at the events in our lives and what new narratives we can create, both as individuals and as a community. What is the story we want to weave together? And so as I close this part of our story together, I wish you all a happily ever after. And though I cannot guarantee that that can happen, I do wish that for each and every one of you, that is your story, and that you find the stories that you create both in yourselves and as a congregation that will lead you to the happily ever after, the vision of who you want to be. And I think you all can live into that dream together. Blessed be.
Reverend Derek's story about singing and many of the stories we heard with the Playback Theater Ensemble on Friday night are ones of redefining oneself over and against stories imposed upon us by the outside world. And they're stories of recognizing our own inner wisdom when transformation had to come. You know, those moments where you start to feel something inside where you're like, this is not right. And then it grows and then it grows and it grows, and transformation has to happen. Because the risk of not changing is actually more dangerous than the risk of the change. So Derek, in listening to his heart of hearts, to that still small voice within, knew he was a singer. And that singer inside of him was pushing back, saying, I'm here. Don't forget about me. It's only when we're able to reclaim truths we know about ourselves that we're able to craft a new narrative and live fully into what we have been given by the universe, by biology, however you define it. But we all come with gifts that we share. And the stories many of you shared on Friday night likewise involved reclaiming a piece of who you were, asserting your autonomy over it, and living into the fullness of yourselves, owning all of your beautiful parts, claiming all of who you are. And so I ask, what does it mean? I'm going to shift to the congregation now. What does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist in Columbus, Indiana? Who are you as a UU, and how can you claim it? When I reflect on those questions as a UU living in Southern Indiana myself, I often start with the narratives that I'm imagining other people have about us, right? The narratives from non-UUs. And there are many non-UUs in Southern Indiana. I could go on and on about how I imagine others perceive us. Some who are atheist and anti-religious may feel like we as UUs are too religious, right? And they say, oh, I don't need a church at all. Others who are more aligned with one particular faith tradition might feel we aren't Muslim enough or Christian enough or Hindu enough, even though within Unitarian Universalism, we have practitioners of all of those religions and more. But even though I started there, I don't want to dwell there. I don't want to dwell on others' perceptions of us. If we've learned anything this weekend, it is that we must define for ourselves who we are as a people and as a church to live fully into our own integrity and authority and into our own full possibility. To fully use all of the gorgeousness of this church. I saw it this weekend with many of you. We need to leverage this power in our North American capitalist society because, frankly, there's so much oppression and there's so much hurt. It's important to claim who we are, declaring it for ourselves and for the world, and living into our fullest vision for who we can become within these walls, within this city and the region, and within the state of Indiana. Because I've been at the State House and they're passing some laws that, frankly, are very hurtful to many of our people. This faith has the power to save lives. This weekend, I've heard of some of you tell of the stories of the home that you found here at this church, the affirmation you found to fully be who you really are. And one of my colleagues at the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, our national headquarters in Boston, he recently told of his experience. He shared that as a teen, he was wayward and lost. He really was wrestling with knowing who he was. And he wasn't sure that he wanted to continue living. He had attended a local UU church with his family before, but as his mental health spiraled downward, he decided not to go so much anymore. And so he had stopped. But his parents, seeing him struggle, encouraged him to go back to the youth group and to give it a try. And so it was at the UU church's youth group where he found community, where he found friends, and he didn't feel so alone, where his depression began to ease and that veil that comes over you, felt like it was swallowing him, started to lift. At his UU church, and our churches are such great places for this, his peers mirrored to him who they saw him to be and reminded him of who he was when he was unable to remember for himself. The UU church saved his life as a teen, and now as a 50-year-old, he's given that much of his life in service to youth ministry in our faith. So I encourage you to think about what lives has this church already saved, because I'm sure it has, and what lives can it save? As you know, people in our world are hurting. There's always hurt. It comes along with being human. But with the time that we are in right now, coming out of COVID, people are still really struggling. So many people were feeling alone before the pandemic, but COVID only forced many of us into further isolation, further into spaces that felt safe, but it's been really hard for us to come back out. We have our trans rights that are under attack, and our trans siblings are telling us it is very hard to be a trans person in the world today, with others telling them their experiences and their stories don't matter. And our children and youth are struggling. They've missed a year of schooling and socializing because of the pandemic, and they're still trying to bounce back. There's a middle school in Bloomington that has reached out to me and shared that a lot of our middle schoolers, they're seeing a high rate of self-harming right now. And I know from my own experience with my own kids, it's really hard to find a play therapist for our littlest kids. I could just go on and on and on. There's so much need. But I want to focus on where Unitarian Universalism and the world's great needs intersect. We've spent this weekend reflecting on who you know yourselves to be and envisioning who you can be. The UU Congregation of Columbus, Indiana, is a church of resilience. It is a congregation that it has a will to live. You've been through trials and tribulations since the earliest days of your inception. There were members who've lost their lives in automobile accidents, and the congregation went on hiatus for some time. Yet the members eventually resurrected the church and began meeting once again. There's been conflict in the church's history over location and how decisions have been made. Ministers have come and gone. And yet you're all still here. You made grand plans in 2019, and then there was a global pandemic that came and threw everything askew. But you're still here. And so it's time to ask yourselves what those of you who are here need now. But more importantly, it's time to ask yourselves what those of you who are not here need now. Who is missing in these rows? Who is in your future story? And how can you invite them in? How do you invite those in who do not know of this place, this magical place on Goler Road, on Goler Boulevard? I invite you to consider how you, as an individual or committee you're on, can start with just one small focused task. You don't have to take on all of the hurt, but what's one small focused task that you can do to create a safe space to reach out, to connect, to serve Columbus, to serve our state? How might you bring your individual and collective skills and interests to bear to meet the world's great need? For the sake of us all, you're a courageous and resilient community. We've spent the weekend telling your story and casting a vision for the future. How might you weave a story whose web's spindles reach far beyond those of us here today, telling others about the greatness of this place where people are encouraged to bring the fullness of themselves so that one day their stories can be bound up in yours? Claim your autonomy, define who you are, and share it, please, with our hungering, aching, and warming world that so desperately longs for healing and liberation. You have everything you need to start here.